All right. Welcome everyone to Metronome's webinar with Snowflake, how Snowflake built its monetization operating model. Before we get started, I wanted to do some quick housekeeping for everyone attending. This session will be recorded and you will receive a link afterwards so you can catch up on anything that you wanted to review or send it to any colleagues who couldn't join us. And we'll pass along additional resources with this webinar afterwards. If you have any questions during the webinar, we will be doing live Q&A, so feel free to drop those in the Q&A box in your platform. We'll address as many as we can, and if we don't get to any, we'll be showing up afterwards to answer any of your questions. And in this webinar, there's a few things we'll be covering. First, the Snowflake monetization playbook, lessons learned from Snowflake, and some takeaways that you can start applying immediately, as well as the Q&A. And with that, I will hand it over to Scott to kick things off.
Awesome. Well, I'm really excited to chat today with Ryan. I'm Scott, CEO, co-founder of Metronome, but the star of this show is Ryan. I think he's been working as the director of product finance over at Snowflake for a while now, and I think we are super excited because about 2 to 3 weeks ago, we had him at our at a conference in Napa, and he gave this talk that was about like Snowflake and their internal operating model. It very much felt resonant with a bunch of the work that we've been doing recently with some of our largest customers. And his talk was honestly one of the highest rated ones of the entire thing. And I think in part because it mixes this great mix of like pragmatic, like detail oriented, but also high level extracted lessons. And it's also studying one of the companies that, in my opinion, kind of pioneered the usage-based model in infrastructure SaaS, and that's Snowflake. And so I wanted to have Ryan here to kind of like share some of that knowledge with the rest of the world. Maybe Ryan, let's start with a little bit of an intro, like who you are, kind of how you came into pricing, and then I'll jump in, talk a little bit more about Metronome, and then we'll hand it over to you to give your talk.
That sounds great. Thanks, Scott. And, happy to be here today. Wonderful to meet everybody. So as Scott mentioned, I'm Ryan. I lead our product finance and pricing team at Snowflake. I've been at Snowflake for a little over 3 years. Originally came in on the pricing team. Before my life at Snowflake, I spent about 4.5, 5 years at McKinsey doing a lot of software pricing, but also things like go-to-market and even some of our private equity diligence. Before that, I was in the military for a few years. And so I've really enjoyed my experience at Snowflake. I've learned a ton, have made a lot of mistakes, and so happy to share some of those lessons today with all of you.
Very cool. Well, awesome. Let me start by just telling everyone a little bit about Metronome and kind of why we're here, why we're kind of hosting this event, and then I'll definitely hand it off to you to learn from the best. So, at a high level, the way that we think about Metronome, kind of why we exist, is we had this realization somewhere around 5 years ago that there was this category of software called billing. Its kind of job was to issue invoices once a month, but that for this emergent kind of usage-based, outcome-based businesses, they actually needed a very different architecture and infrastructure. And so Metronome is what we call monetization infrastructure. So we basically help companies kind of fulfill the full life cycle of monetization, from like what do you offer your customers in terms of like a discount or a pricing structure, and then flow that through your product, make sure that your product is showing customers real-time dashboards and how they're spending money, give them budgeting tools, and ultimately obviously issue invoices once a month. We realized that in order to solve that problem for these super fast-growing AI businesses and then also infrastructure businesses, you actually needed a data-centric architecture. And so Metronome is that. We are lucky enough to get to work with some of the fastest growing companies in the history of the world, companies like OpenAI and Anthropic, but also some of the most important both infra and AI companies like NVIDIA and Confluent and Databricks and many others, including small startups. So we're super excited. I think one of my personal kind of passions is just studying the greats, like how do they make these models work? And one of the things that we've learned is that if you try to think of like Snowflake as just a business model, it's like you pay for what you use. You kind of like think of the top part of what we call the iceberg. You can theoretically understand like how that business works. You're like, okay, I just need to charge for storage and compute, and I guess my NRR will magically be 200%. But if you actually study Snowflake behind the scenes, or Databricks, or any of these like legendary companies, you realize that the way that you get to 200% NRR, the way that you get to that magical flywheel, is actually by focusing on all the things that are like the lower part of this diagram. Things like customer experience, things like how do you make it easy and frictionless to launch products without confusing users on pricing and packaging? How do you enable your RevRec teams or your finance teams to kind of seamlessly recognize revenue without needing to kind of go through contortions in order to like understand exactly how much money should they recognize? All of that like detail work is kind of what makes usage really hard. And so we're super lucky to have Ryan here, because he's what we came up with this term a couple of months ago that is like the chief value officer, this person who's like really obsessed with the entire monetization engine. And I think at Snowflake, Ryan is like a good exemplar of that. So with that, Ryan, I wanted you to kind of just like start by introducing how monetization works at Snowflake, the kind of the machine that you've built, and then the lessons learned. So I'll hand it over to you. I think we like the audience is going to have a ton of questions. So definitely feel free to go through, and and at the end, we'll definitely take time for questions. But with that, I'll hand it over to Ryan.
Thanks, Scott. Well, first I'll start by saying there was a lot of great work done before I got to Snowflake. So, I'm building on the backs of a lot of great work done by a lot of great people. But I think as Snowflake has scaled and it's started to become more of a multi-product company, we really felt the need to invest in, a pricing team and a system where we could move really fast and make the right pricing decisions based on the information that we have available. And frankly, I think the pricing strategy and what pricing level you're going to be at, what pricing metric you're going to use, that's all the fun, sexy stuff that I think gets everybody excited. But honestly, I think a lot of the main lessons are, once those decisions are made, how do you actually get that out to market? How do you make sure that customers are billed the way that they expect to be billed? How do you keep things simple? How do you reinforce the value via enablement and communications? And so, there's a lot that goes into the system once you've even made the pricing decision. So I'm hoping to spend some time on those pieces today too, as well. So the way we think about it at Snowflake is, we kind of have a 5-part system. And I've tried to simplify this a bit. Obviously, there's a lot of nuance in each one of these steps, but at a very high level, we think about 5 steps in our end-to-end system. We think about defining the pricing itself. We think about the research and all the diligence that needs to go into making the right informed pricing decision. We then think about the design, which is once you've gotten kind of a definition of what are we building, what's the value prop, who are we going after, and then you marry that with the research. You then design the actual pricing model, the pricing system, and the plan in which you're going to take that to go to market. And then we have our 4th step is really around the decision and the governance, right? How do we get the company on board with what we're actually going to go do and make sure that we're aligned across all the various functional leadership and stakeholders to have a single voice when we talk about this with customers. And then the most important step, in my opinion, is the 5th step, which is the realize and learn, or you can think about this as the feedback process. But this is, once your pricing committee has made a decision that we're going to go do something, making sure that the enablement, the story, the measurement, the reporting, all the systems are all in line for you to be able to take that to market and go be successful. So I'm going to spend some time today kind of walking through each one of these steps. One thing that I do want to stress today is I don't want this just to be an academic exercise of, hey, pricing theory suggests you should do X, here's the right framework. I also want to spend time on, what really can go wrong, what's hard about these steps. When you look at a slide like this, everything seems like it's all sequential and structured and ordered, but in reality, that's not how it works on the ground. And so I want to use the opportunity to share a little bit about what we at Snowflake have learned, especially in an era of AI where pricing is changing every other week. There's tons of features being built. The ability to do this at scale is a very different thing than if you're pricing, 2 or 3 products a year. But before we jump in, I'm going to spend a little bit of time too on just kind of how we organize ourselves at Snowflake. So it starts with kind of, if you think about who at Snowflake is in charge of designing the pricing policy, the pricing strategy, and how we think about pricing our products overall. And then at some point, you do hand it over to more of the operational side when you think about how do you think about discount guardrails? How do you think about price control? How do you think about the contractual elements and the terms that go with pricing? And so the way we've thought about it at Snowflake is we do have a dedicated pricing team. I'm going to talk about in a second where that pricing team lives and how it's organized. But we do have a dedicated pricing team that works very closely with our product organization, our engineering organization, and even in some cases, some of our specialized go-to-market teams. And we are really the owner or the supporter of how we build the right pricing architecture, the right pricing plan, the right pricing strategy. But we also work very closely with our deal desk team, and our deal desk team is the team that's responsible then for taking that pricing, translating that into our pricing list, our discount matrix, how we think about then thinking about how that pricing gets realized in an individual customer contract. And so we work very closely with that team. I've seen in my prior life, there are worlds where these two teams are actually all on the same team, which, I think helps drive a little bit more consistency. I think at our scale, though, and the reason we want to keep those teams at least separate right now is that the pricing team is very much embedded and focused on upstream, how features are coming to market. And then the deal desk team is more focused on the execution side with customers and with the account teams on the ground. So if I go to the next slide, I think when you think about now double clicking into that pricing team itself, right? So left hand of the prior chart, there's a few different ways you can potentially organize and structure this. And I think Snowflake over time, at least during my time here, has evolved this model. I would say when I first came in, we were more in the camp of this first bucket, which is sort of a central functional team. These teams tend to be helpful when you're more of a single product, single SKU company. You don't have a lot of crazy volume. You're more focused on how do I keep the pricing narrative consistent as you expand in new markets, new regions, making sure that the economics make sense. But it's a team that can quickly either have to delegate a lot of pricing responsibility to other parts of the organization, or will at some point need to specialize as you move to more of kind of a multi-product type offering. And so what we at Snowflake have done is decided to move to more of this hub and spoke center of excellence model. And the reason I'm calling it that is because, our pricing team today is about 8 or 9 folks. We also play a finance role as well. So we're wearing multiple hats. And 8 or 9 folks in a world where you have 200 plus PMs, you have 1,000 plus engineers, is never going to be in every single conversation, making every single decision. And so the way we think about it is we specialize by kind of our main product verticals, but our job is to more instill what are the pricing principles, what's the pricing process, how do you go through kind of a PRD and think about pricing early on, so that we can kind of put out what good looks like and act as that center of excellence. But we don't always need to be in every single conversation across the entire company because we just can't scale to do that given our size. Now, we still have a very formal process and governance and how we ultimately get those pricing decisions live and in the market. And I'll talk about that in a few slides. But we have found that this works really well. Now, I'll also say, sometimes there are unique opportunities or custom non-standard type deals where we may even need to move to more of a program-based type tiger team model. And those are even scenarios where we work very closely with deal desk on very large strategic deals that might have very custom style pricing. So all that to say, I think based on where you are as a company in terms of the size and the maturity, what the product portfolio looks like, plus the need to kind of flex up and down with certain types of customers in very strategic or non-standard type deals, you may end up looking at a few of these different options. But Snowflake today, I think, has primarily centered on this hub and spoke center of excellence model.
Ryan, actually that last point's really interesting. It sounds like you're mostly this hub and spoke, but you have the capability or the capacity to flex across these different things, maybe for a specific deal or in specific points in time. How do you think about the what is unique about the way that you're running the team that lets you kind of both have this center of excellence, but also like a fairly mutable or kind of like flexible way? Like, is there anything different about how you think about like the hiring profile or the types of people on that team or the way that team is empowered to kind of enable that level of like both like control structure, rigor, but also flexibility when flex needs to come?
Yeah, no, that's a great question, Scott. I think so. One point to add on that is I personally believe the fact we live in finance allows us to be sort of that flexible team that can scale up and down across a number of different scenarios. For example, if we were a team that lived purely in product, it wouldn't necessarily make a ton of sense in a lot of cases then to go work on commercial non-standard deals with very large strategic customers,
Mhm.
because that tends to be more of a finance deal desk or even like a commercial strategy type role.
Mhm.
So I think the structure and where we live in the organization allows us to do that. And I think also the context we have around more of kind of your traditional FP&A type functions where it's revenue forecasting, it's, P&L management, it's those types of functions allows us to bring a lot of insight into the pricing process and then also even into these types of deals that gives us the right context, the right framing in order how to think about the business problem, even when it extends beyond just a pricing problem. And then from a talent perspective, I think our team is a bit unique in finance. We've strived to hire people that I think have a bit of a technical background, right? Can almost be a bit of a hybrid between a pricing person and almost maybe a commercial oriented PM in some cases. And then we've also really strived to go after people that come from kind of a strategy consulting or even banking type background where, look, they can understand numbers, they can understand pricing from a theory perspective, but they can also just be a really good generalist problem solver, right? And work across the organization, talk to leadership up and down. And so, thankfully, Snowflake's invested in those types of resources in finance. But I think those where we sit and then the skill sets we've gone after allow us to play a lot of different roles.
Yeah, I think the other thing I would just say, and I think this is like a testament to you, but also to your leadership team, is that I think in the Valley, like Snowflake's finance team is known as like a center of excellence. Like it's like truly like legendary DNA there, and so I do think that kind of just core competency has earned it the trust to be able to both be independent of product and yet help influence product. Whereas you can imagine a more product centric org with maybe a more nascent finance team would have a lot more trouble like influencing product in the way that it sounds like you need to be able to do, which is really cool. So that's awesome.
Yeah, no, fully agree. Okay, so where I was going to go next is I'm going to start to kind of work through that 5-part system and kind of bring you all into how Snowflake thinks about from when a feature is first getting ideated in the product organization, how does we in the finance and the pricing teams start to engage and then kind of work through that system? So that first stage, if you remember, is really all around definition. So I would say we have a very great relationship with a lot of our product teams. Our team tends to be embedded in a lot of the core processes that happen in the day-to-day, whether that's product reviews, whether that's steercos with leadership, whether it's monthly business reviews. We try to have a seat at the table and we try to move as further upstream as we possibly can so we can help influence some of those decisions, right? And I think one thing I'll add is just kind of a learning for me and something that might not be obvious on the page, but sometimes in the role we're in, that requires us to go even above and beyond maybe what's in your job description, right? Like being super helpful to these folks and kind of helping them get things done helps earn a seat at the table. And that's really important because particularly when it comes to pricing, if you're catching things late, if you're catching things, when it's about to become generally available, or if it's 30 days before launch, you are going to have a very limited opportunity to shape or influence how that pricing decision is getting made because any change you now recommend potentially puts the launch at risk, right? And so I would encourage everybody to make sure that either formally through a process or even just informally in the way you work, you are finding ways to add value to product and finding ways to insert yourself as early on in the process as you possibly can. Now, once you're starting to define what that is, product's going to have a lot of thoughts, right, about the user model, the persona, some of the technical considerations. I think the thing that we try to come in and reinforce is from a pricing perspective, what is our value prop? How do we want to position this, right? Is this a core extension of the existing platform? And our goal is really like, let's just make sure we cover costs. Or is this actually a super differentiated feature that's unique and that is maybe going to cause Snowflake to be perceived as higher value, in which case you'd be more focused on a premium. Who's the buyer? Who are we going after? Is it our traditional persona that we go after today, or is this potentially a new person, right? Is it more of a developer? Is it more of a Spark engineer? And then starting to also think about what is the right pricing metric itself. Now, you're not making decisions on the pricing metric at this point, but I think you're laying out options. And you're saying, once I start to go into more of that research phase, what are the right questions that we want to ask to inform, what do customers think will be fair? What is going to be predictable? What can we audit on the back end from a systems perspective? And then starting to think about, what does good look like? What would success here be for this feature, assuming we get the pricing right? So I think it's really important to lay all that out and write some of that stuff down, because as you get closer and closer to launch, there's going to be a lot of urgency and push to get it out, to ship it. And you're not going to have a lot of time to go back and revisit some of these key questions. And you want to lay out kind of a core hypothesis before you jump into the next phase, which is really focused on research. So if we go to that next phase, then I would say, once you have that definition of what you want to test, what you want to try and go do, I think it is super important then to go do research. Now, research can be a lot of different flavors, right? It can be everything from a formal conjoint survey where you're doing all sorts of different scenarios and measuring elasticity, measuring willingness to pay. In some cases, it could be a Slack thing where I Slack a bunch of our account teams and say, hey, look, if I price it at X, do you think it'd be too expensive? If I price it at Y, do you think it'd be too expensive? If I didn't charge for it, would you have a problem with it? Right. So you can get creative with the different research methods. But I think what you're really trying to test is, from a pricing metric perspective, will customers understand what is your metric, and does that scale with the value that I am getting out of this offering or this feature? And then really making sure that you measure the willingness to pay however you get there. I always tell people, I think an adage I've heard internally and an adage I've heard in talking to other pricing leaders is often, well, if you're in a rush, just price it high, or just price it the way your competitor prices it. And if you're wrong, the market will tell you you're wrong, and then you can change your price. And I always say, well, that's a really expensive way to learn that you're wrong, right? Because when that happens, typically what's gone on is you've drummed up a whole launch plan. You now have a whole marketing campaign around that feature. You're now activating the field with a bunch of enablement and a bunch of incentives for them to go sell this thing. If you find out you're wrong, you've now spent a lot of money and spent a lot of time with a lot of people. A survey or a few customer conversations or emailing, 100 of your top account teams just to go get more intelligence around what people will be likely willing to pay is a much cheaper way to at least start to narrow down the range of where you need to operate. And then, one thing that's always important, and I'm putting more of my finance hat on, is making sure that you cover your costs, right? Pricing something where your costs are not aligned to revenue is a huge risk. But also then making sure that all the downstream teams have line of sight to what are you doing? How are you going to price this thing? You don't need to answer all the questions yet, but it is super helpful in my experience to give these teams a very early read on what is coming so they can do the right planning and assessment and make sure that they get all their questions answered. And just a lesson from Snowflake in my experience is, one, research is often the step that you skip or you go the fastest through. And so I would encourage everybody to find ways to make sure you do not skip the research stage. In a world that's moving faster and faster and faster, the temptation will always be match your competitor, price it the way you did on the product you launched last year. So find ways to automate this, find ways to do this in a more scaled fashion. I think with all the AI tools that are out there today, there's becoming more and more creative ways to do this, but do not skip this step. And I think for the commercial ops side, make sure you give these people a heads up and find standardized ways that if you know the questions they're going to have in advance, you've gotten kind of policies or processes down where you can answer those things relatively quickly, because the last thing you want to do is spend 10 or 15 30-minute meetings with all these various stakeholders answering the same questions that you answered last time you did a product launch. So I'll pause there, but the research stage is super critical in my mind, and there's a lot of opportunity to do well, but there's also a lot of pitfalls to avoid.
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing I would underline here, especially if you're on the smaller side, is again, if you go talk to like a McKinsey and you talk about research, it's like a 6-month conjoin, and it's like that is completely unnecessary in my opinion. Like from almost all things, it's like it starts by like there's this book called The Mom Test, and I think they just talk. It's like talk to your user and try to explain the value, and then ask them to repeat back the value. And if the way you explain it is different than the way they explain it, or if the way they explain it is super muddy and messy, like that's a problem. But that's not a problem. That's a pricing problem per se. It's actually a marketing problem. It's a perception problem. And again, if your customer can't concretely like summarize that back to you in a simple way, then probably there's a whole bunch of other things that are not happening around like value communication, all this stuff. But I think what I find that is the most, like it's kind of like, it's like when it works, it's like very simple because you have a very simple conversation. You and the customer are more or less like, yep, I agree. And then we have a conversation about, okay, like this elasticity point. It's like, and then if I do more of this, will you perceive that as more valuable? And it's like, the answer is like, yeah, of course. Like if, it's like traditional SaaS. It's like if more of my organization has access to the same data, I think that is more valuable. Like in the example of Slack, like clearly the value scales with headcount or seats or whatever. And I think in these usage models, it's really tempting to kind of get super clever and like invent a new concept. But if your users can't repeat it back to you in a very simple way, guess what? They can't repeat it back to the economic buyer in a simple way. They can't like justify this like purchase price in a simple way. And again, I think simplicity is the thing. And then user understandability is like super, super critical. And even at large scale, I see, like teams like Ryan's, they're just like talking to customers. Like, it's like, yeah, sometimes they deploy a conjoin. Okay, great. But like a lot of times it's just common sense. And this is also why I think a lot of PMs can really help, because PMs should be the experts on the user. They should be able to like be a very fast filter of like, here's this like nuts metric that we invented. If the PM should be a filter for like, this is way too complex. Like user's not going to understand this. And I think that like some of this simple stuff I think is like really, really powerful. And honestly, it kind of resolves back to spend more time with your customers and talk to them, or the field and talk to them. Cause it's, and even if you just like always do that, it does not need to be the long pole in any process. In fact, it can be the fastest. It'll save you the most time if you do it.
I agree. And, one other thing I wanted to add on this slide that I was thinking about as you were going through that, Scott, is you can almost read a slide like this and listen to what Scott and I just said and assume that, okay, if I follow the right process, it's going to spit out the right answer for me. And then once I get the right answer, it's like, okay, now I'm on to the next step. Unfortunately, it doesn't work that way in my experience.
No.
And I'll give you an example. We were considering a new AI feature and pricing that recently. And there were a lot of people considering potentially even changing the pricing metric altogether. And we went out, we did a survey with a bunch of our account teams. We actually had our user research org do not a full conjoint, but more of a Van Westendorp. And the research came back kind of mixed. There were people that were like, yeah, let's change the pricing metric. That's the industry standard. There were people that said, no, let's stick to our existing one and fold it into our existing usage-based model. And at the end of the day, I think, there's a bit of judgment that comes in. And so leaning again on product leadership, people who understand like how the economics work, and leaning also on your sales leadership too, to get kind of that voice of the customer is really important. But these things are not always the easiest decisions, even if you do follow all the right research steps. And that's where I think getting reps on this stuff can be super helpful.
Totally.
All right. So moving to the next step. So this is now more of the design. And the reason I bring up the design is I think of this as kind of what's my checklist to make sure I'm ready to take this to market. And I'm putting together the final pricing proposal. And there's a lot of steps and a lot of pieces that are super important here. And it's very easy to think about. Probably if you look at this slide and you think about these 4 buckets, most people will think about, when I'm ready to put together a pricing proposal, it's really that left column. It's the pricing brief, right? It's I got to put slides together to go to pricing committee and present this to leadership, or it's I've got to write the email to get things approved by my formal process. That's a super critical step. And it's a great forcing function to kind of bring that research all together and make a final decision or proposal. But there are 3 other tiles on this slide. And I find that right before you're going to go out and launch a pricing change or a new pricing for a new feature altogether, making sure that you don't skip the other 3 tiles is super important. And I'll give you an example. Recently, Snowflake made a pricing change. And I would say in that process, we did the left 3 of this really well. We had a good hypothesis on why we wanted to change our price. We had modeled all the economic impact of that. We worked with all of our systems teams to think about the billing changes, the invoicing changes, all the things around rev rec and accounting. We'd even stood up measurement. We had dashboards. We understood potentially what the short-term revenue drop would be, but then what's the metric we want to measure to see if it's working. However, we didn't fully round out the 4th step. And I think the lesson for us was, look, the communication and the enablement and the stuff you put into the field so that they know why you made that change. What is the call to action for them that they need to go do now to take advantage of this? And what are the tools and the things that they need to understand to feel confident about that? That was not fully in place by the time the pricing change launched. And so there was a missed opportunity where we could have done better, I think, to really reinforce and close the loop on how do we make the most of a pricing change that was giving a lot of value back to customers. And so, again, in the spirit of kind of sharing learnings and trying to understand why there's 4 tiles on this slide, don't skip any of these steps, because they can be super important to not just making sure you made the right decision, but making sure that you're giving yourself the best chance at being successful on that pricing decision.
Yeah, the way I think about it, I mean, you kind of talked about it earlier, but the thing that I see the most common across companies is they'll skip a step, like let's say enablement or something, and then they'll run the experiment. And what will happen is the market will reject the experiment. There's a lot of the AI agents actually have run this experiment in public very recently, and the truth is was the experiment was that a good result? It's kind of like not controlling your variables in science class. It's like, I don't know what I learned. I guess I learned that if I don't wash my hands and then touch a petri dish, that random things will grow. And it's like, that doesn't actually teach me anything. And I think if you instead think of it almost like what can I learn about the market, the product market pricing? How can I learn? You actually kind of have to control all the variables. And, picking on enablement, field enablement is in some sense one of the most important ones, because if your field doesn't know how to talk about a thing, guess what they're going to do? They're not going to talk about the thing, or they're going to sell it in a way that makes no sense and doesn't align to the actual value. And then they're going to get a sale, but then the customer's going to churn or whatever. And I think it's just super important that it's not, these steps exist to run a clean experiment and to help you learn at the maximum possible rate. And when you look at it that way, you actually kind of are it's less that you're not skipping steps. It's more if you don't do these things, then you're not going to learn anything, and you're going to have wasted a ton of time. And I think that's the frame that I think is really important for folks, because otherwise it feels to move faster, I can skip steps, but it's kind of no, in order to move maximally fast, you actually have to do all of the things.
Couldn't agree more. Yeah, no, absolutely. So I'll keep us moving along here. So the next step, this is our 4th step, is really around the governance, right? How do you make the actual pricing decision and make sure that everybody in the company is aligned on that decision and that it makes sense across all the buckets we've been talking about? Now, traditionally, a lot of people have organized around a pricing committee, right? Or some sort of governing body that involves a lot of your core functional stakeholders to kind of all make sure that their concerns and their areas of how that price will affect their team has been addressed and thought through, right? So it's everything from, making sure the margins make sense, that we cover our costs as they scale, to are we really aligning the way we're pricing it to the value prop and the positioning and the messaging with the customer? Legal wants to make sure that all the terms that we already have in our traditional, contracts and terms are all being adhered to, right? So you can understand why it's important to have a lot of people from various stakeholders on that committee. Now, one thing we at Snowflake have learned is the pace at which we are launching features and making pricing decisions has increased tremendously. And a lot of times you're not necessarily introducing something that is super novel, something that's super new, where you're talking about a new pricing metric or a new buyer or anything like that. And so what we've innovated with is we've said, look, historically, we've done live meetings with the committee and reviewed this stuff in pretty exhaustive detail to make sure everybody's on the same page. But in some cases where we are introducing something that is either kind of a standard on the truck offering, or in some cases where we might just be offering something that matches what the market is offering, let's find a more scaled way to do that. And so we've stood up more of a workflow that is email-based, that runs through kind of ServiceNow and gets all of our approvers to add this stuff to our pricing list. And we have put in a lot of the same diligence and content that we would have done in a live pricing committee, but we found a way to make that more of an automated workflow. And that's allowed us to scale and cover a lot of other pricing decisions that would have had to either been batched or delayed to make that decision or that review, or in some cases would not have gone through as formal of a process. And so I would encourage folks, as your company gets bigger, as you move to more of a multi-product offering, find ways where you can have the right level of governance, where audit and those types of folks are still comfortable that all this stuff is being reviewed and decided upon by the key stakeholders, but you are finding a way to scale that so that you can still meet the needs of the business and move fast and get things out.
Cool.
All right. And then, so if we go to kind of my last step, this is the realize and learn and feedback measurement. I would say, often similar to research, this is an area that gets skipped. And I find in many cases in the current environment that we're in, everybody's sort of on to the next really fast. And I think, again, similar to if you don't do the research, you miss a cheap opportunity to learn. If you don't do the feedback and close the loop afterwards, you also miss an opportunity to learn. And so if you've done the work up front to set up the right reporting, the right measurement, leverage that along with doing things like surveys or regular check-ins with your sales leadership, your product leadership, to make sure that they understand, hey, what are we hearing on the ground? What are we hearing from customers? Is the hypothesis that we had in the beginning playing out? Are we making as much money as we thought we were going to make? Setting all that stuff up early enables you to do that in a seamless way, because you don't want to be setting that stuff up after you've launched, because it's really hard given the pace and the level of work on everyone's plate to go do that. But this is a really important step that, frankly, I think even we at Snowflake want to do a better job at, is closing that feedback loop and more consistently getting feedback on pricing itself.
Yeah, my frame is like, in some sense, this is the only valuable step, or the most. Like, it's like, if you actually think of it as an iterated long-term game, your job is actually to learn the most per unit time. And so in some sense, if you just like skip the learning step, or the detailed learning step, you're kind of like, well, why did you do all that work in the first place? Because if you understand that, like, this is the first of like 1,000 future pricing changes, then the earlier you can learn those lessons in that 1,000-step cycle, the more you will be able to grow at the end. And so I would definitely encourage like everyone to it's really easy to go on to the next, but it's kind of like why in engineering you always do a postmortem. You do a postmortem because there are going to be future incidents, like, as much as you don't want that to be. And like the same thing with pricing. Like, if you're successful, you're going to be doing a lot more of it in the future than you did in the past. So might as well learn now.
And I'll also stress too, look, this doesn't always have to just be your own pricing decisions, right? Joining a community like Scott has built with Metronome, or, talking to other pricing leaders, there's opportunities to learn a lot from what others have done too. And so, I know time is always limited, but I would encourage folks as finance and pricing and product leaders, go spend time talking to people who've kind of gone through this before you and figure out what's worked, what's not worked, right? Particularly in the age of AI, there's so much great content out there around, Substack and podcasts and things Scott talks about as well. So kind of go do reps from what other people have learned ahead of you having to go through the growing pains of doing it yourself. All right, so with that, I wanted to maybe just kind of recap by saying, there's been a few things that Snowflake has learned as it's scaled that I just want to kind of reinforce here. And some of these are kind of in the steps, the 5 system steps that we had talked about, but some of them are also just things that I want to highlight. So first thing we talked about is do not skip the research. In my opinion, it is a very cheap way to figure out how close are you going to be to your hypothesis before you go spin up a bunch of sales and marketing and a bunch of opportunity cost in the market with customers where your reputation's at risk. Second, communicate far more often than you think you do. It can become very easy to say, I have this great relationship with product. We all understand each other. But remember, there are many other stakeholders at the company. And as soon as you hear something, communicate that far and wide. The third one is, look, the launch and the execution of the pricing, in my opinion, is often even more important than the strategy. You can change the strategy. You can iterate on the strategy. But if you don't get that launch piece right, you can burn a lot of customer trust and you can lose the confidence of even your own sales teams. From a talent perspective, I would encourage you to hire strong generalists. I find that pricing is a gateway to go help solve business problems, right? And you want people at the table who are perceived as people who can help get stuff done, who can help solve hard problems. Pricing is just one area that can be helpful. And then the fifth one is really a point around, if you want to spend more time on research and you want to spend more time on feedback, invest in the systems and the tools and the data that allow you to automate a lot more of that system, because you're not going to have time to spend a lot of time in each one of those 5 stages. So pick the areas that you find are the most important, spend time there, and try to automate as much of the remaining steps as you can. So I would say, just to summarize, my takeaways for this audience is, look, make sure you have a good set of pricing principles that you've established and democratize that across the organization so that you can act as kind of that hub and spoke and that center of excellence and scale with the company. If you haven't already, establish a clear MPI process for how you bring new products to market. Leverage the stuff we talked about today with the system and the 5 steps and try to build that into your MPI process. And then the third one is constantly be paranoid about, how do I go get more feedback and how do I do that at scale in an automated way? So with that, I'll pause there. I know we maybe want to do a little bit of Q&A, but maybe I'll hand it back over to you, Scott. And this is kind of what we've learned and what I would advise everybody to think about from what we've done at Snowflake.
Yeah, no, I think this summary slide and reminder, we'll send out the slides as well. I think your lessons are obviously learned at world scale, like one of the biggest, biggest of the big. But what I would say is they are universal lessons for if you're growing fast, and in the age of AI, it's like basically the lessons are useful in proportion to how often things are changing. So if you're at really big scale, things are changing all the time because you have so many different product lines and all this stuff. But if you're at really small scale, but you're in that iterative loop, things are also changing all the time. And I think the biggest lesson that I've had from working with companies like big and small is that these kinds of things, it's like a muscle. It's like a muscle that only gets better if you use it. And so in a very real sense, it's like the first time you do any of this stuff, you're going to be exhausted. It's like going and trying to, do a deadlift for the first time in your life. You're like, okay, I'm never doing that again. But if you keep it in a regime and you keep honing and practicing and keep the same team focused on it, you actually find that you get a lot faster and more efficient over time. And even if it's like practicing that today is it's like stuff that will pay off in the future. I think the mental model I always think is that again, this is the first of many. if we are successful, when we are successful, we're going to do this a lot more in the future. So like we might as well start to practice and get it good now. And I think Ryan, your kind of playbook, your framework is a really good set of things to pay attention to as you're starting to assemble that machine. And it's going to take a long time. And I think the other thing that you didn't say explicitly, but I will say on your behalf, is that like Snowflake is a machine that is improving every year. I think like you joined and it worked pretty well and now it works better, but I'm sure there's more iterations to come. And that's the fun part about pricing, is that it's like kind of definitionally unsolvable. Yeah. And products are constantly changing. And so getting kind of, it's like enjoy the process, enjoy the type 2 fun of it all, I think is actually kind of like really critical in order to kind of get the longevity and the kind of sustained success over time. So with that, I think we're going to bring on Alexa, who's going to have some questions for you, Ryan.
All right, we had a lot of questions coming through. So for folks who haven't had a chance to ask any questions, if you have anything on your mind, feel free to drop that in the Q&A. For any questions that we don't have time to get to, we will follow up with you afterwards. But I'll kick it off with first question, Ryan, from Craig. His question was, where does the enablement responsibility lie at Snowflake? Do you have a dedicated team set up for this, or does it fall on the pricing team?
Yeah, that's a great question, Craig. So I would say we have a dedicated enablement function. It lives in our go-to-market organization. It actually lives under kind of our revenue operations function. And they're responsible for really making sure the content is in place and then it is distributed in the right way to all the right people across the right channel. I would say when it comes to a new product launch or even a pricing change, we often tend to be very upstream of that. Our team is responsible in partnership with product to come up with kind of what is the storyline, what is the content that we think we need to get out, what is the story we need to tell. And then we're often working very closely with marketing and then even like our sales strategy teams to kind of put together that comprehensive deck or that snippet or that newsletter. And then we're handing it over to the enablement team. They bring a lot of expertise then on what they've seen work well before and how to edit and adapt that content. And then they'll be responsible for distributing it and getting it out. So we play a role in shaping it, but we don't actually end up owning the entire enablement plan for a pricing change or a pricing launch.
Great. The next question from Johanna is, what is the role your team plays in ensuring that the pricing guidelines or goals are being followed with your sales teams?
It's a good question. I would say the main way we do that is in partnership with our deal desk team. So, I think, again, back to the early part of the presentation, we come up with that new product introduction policy. We work very closely with audit, legal, et cetera, to establish like our SOX 2 controls and making sure that we're following all the right processes from a pricing perspective. But deal desk then tends to be the sales or the field facing function that actually executes and adheres to all of those policies and all those rules. Now, oftentimes, if there's a very kind of non-standard, non-traditional structure, we will actually work very closely, kind of in a small tiger team, with deal desk to make those decisions and kind of go through that process. But we as a pricing team can't scale to cover, all the different deals and all the different things that sales wants to do. And so the way we do that is we try to get leverage through that team. And then we try to institute a lot of those actual policies in our CPQ tool, in Salesforce itself. So a lot of that stuff comes out of the box by default.
Great. Thank you. The next question that we had was from Sean. What do you think teams overlook the most when it comes to pricing changes?
I might have a bit of recency bias here, but my answer would be making sure you're doing the right enablement and communication with your field team. I think the worst thing you can do is do all the right strategy, all the right thinking, and make a change. And then it's almost like a tree fell in the woods. It's like nobody heard it, nobody saw it, nobody knew it actually happened. And so making sure that you pair a pricing change with a really thoughtful enablement strategy. And actually, personally, you can't always do this because bandwidth is limited, but if you can marry that with an actual sales play or a go-to-market program, that's even better, because ultimately what you want to do is have a rep say, okay, we dropped the price. That is going to help a customer. I'm a little worried about the revenue or the quota implication of that for me, but what should I go do? What is my call to action, right? And that's probably going to be a narrative that I got to go talk to the customer about, or it's a sales program that says, hey, I should ask about this opportunity, or I should talk to this person, right? So you want to kind of marry any pricing change with a thoughtful enablement or go-to-market program. Now, that's obviously coming at it from more of an enterprise perspective and a B2B context. You're probably doing a lot more of that in kind of a PLG or a marketing-led way if you're in a consumer business.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say, is that like, I think what Ryan's saying is exactly right. And then for more PLG self-serve businesses, the failure mode is exactly the same. It's just that your enablement takes the form of like marketing pages. And then I think the most important thing that we see a lot is, I think of it as like value communication. It's like, does your product clearly communicate the new value or the value change in a way that actually makes sense to the customer? So in like if you're like a self-serve PLG thing, is your new product discoverable in a logical way? And then once I start to use it, is it like, is the value meter like centered in the right place in the product, such that I'm thinking about it the right amount, not too much, not too little? And it's like those kinds of things. And that's why I think for the PLG self-serve businesses, it's actually like, it's why you have to be so deeply partnered with product, because actually it's about building a product experience that kind of communicates the new value and the new price in a way that like actually does selling for you. And I think people really underthink that. And then what they see is like flatline growth on the new product line. And they're like, well, it's like, turns out if you don't make this a discoverable product, no one's going to use it. Like, it's kind of like the equivalent of like, if you don't tell sales reps how to sell it, they're not going to sell it. Like, their just incentives aren't there.
Great. The next question that we had was from Francis. How do you size new customers without any usage history?
That's a good question. So this is maybe less of a pricing question, but it is more of a, how do you transact with new customers? How do you size contracts, right? That sort of piece. Pricing plays a role there, because depending on what they're going to be using when they kind of do that first initial land, you need to think about what kind of price point they will likely be at. I would say at Snowflake, personally, we've built tools that say, look, we understand where a customer is coming from in terms of their, incumbent vendor or what they're migrating to Snowflake from. And then based on a lot of historical usage of customers who have looked like that customer and have come from that system, this is generally what they spend on a per unit basis, or this is generally what they consume, either like on a per user basis, or in our examples, a lot of things organized around like database structures, right? Tables and those types of things. And so we've built a lot of like lookalike modeling and tooling that allows us to then estimate, if a customer is coming from Redshift, how, in 99% of the cases, they will spend X with Snowflake at their given size. So that can be a bit bespoke. It depends on the company, but I think my meta point is, if you know your pricing list, and then if you've done a lot of historical new user adoption, try to do as much lookalike modeling as you possibly can.
Yeah. And then the way I would say it, because we work with a lot of companies that are coming to usage for the first time, they don't maybe have the data backing that Snowflake does at this point. We're seeing a trend, which is kind of interesting, which is they have an existing like motion. Maybe it's like a subscription or something like that. They'll introduce the like meter, like the future value metric, like 2 to 3 quarters ahead of when they intend to monetize it. And what they're essentially doing is they're building the product experience around the meter, and they're like kind of baselining usage. And then when they're baselining, before they're charging for it, obviously once you start to charge for it, usage is going to change. But what they're doing is they're kind of building up an initial kind of like data set to do exactly what Ryan is talking about, which is like, okay, successful users on this product, here's where their growth, it's like, is it like day 7 where they start to find fire, or is it day 30? Does it take longer? All that stuff. And what that allows you to do is start to metricize a thing that you're not monetizing and start to build the growth loops and the muscles. And then over time, you kind of cohort in users on a paid basis to kind of build up an understanding. And this doesn't have to take quarters, but you should kind of think about it in like implement the measurement system and the like testing system, and then start to like titrate in monetization, and do it in a cohort-based way. So that's kind of like the lessons from the smaller companies in the field who are kind of just toe dipping here.
Great. We're close on time. We have time for a few more questions. So this next question is from A. Sammy. I know usage-based pricing is the thing everyone's focused on, but how much pushback are you getting from CFOs, considering it's very hard to budget for this when you're the buyer?
Yeah, it's a good question. So I would say it's always been a constant, I think, question for a number of our customers around, hey, how can you help me accurately forecast what I'm going to use, what I'm going to spend? Because, before I go sign this large contract or enter into this long-term partnership with Snowflake, I want the ability to basically be able to know what I'm going to budget and have to spend on Snowflake. Now, I would say this is very difficult again when you're a first year customer, when you're a new customer coming to Snowflake. We talked a little bit about some of the tools we use to help size that. I would say as customers get into kind of their second, third, fourth year, as they start to expand and use the platform more, oftentimes a lot of like their historical spend becomes then a good predictor of what their future spend is going to be. But, some of our largest customers, they have, many different organizations across the globe. They have hundreds and thousands of users. And so their spend can be very volatile on a day-to-day basis. Now, Snowflake has invested a lot in providing cost governance tools where you can set budgets, you can set resource monitors, you can do a lot of control from the admin perspective to hopefully get at some of this. But I think, honestly, it's really being very transparent. It's giving tools to your customers. Sometimes that's through partners, but also sometimes that's native tools that you offer in your own platform that say, look, you're going to have to take a leap of faith probably in that first year, and you're going to have to understand how Snowflake works in your environment. But over time, we're going to invest in being very transparent, not only with our pricing, but also how we think about and size your workloads, especially the new stuff coming. And then we're going to point you to tools and documentation that's going to really help you understand how to plan and budget and monitor those things. That's what you can do from an actual building perspective. I would say the communication and the messaging and the marketing around that also becomes super important because you've got to keep reinforcing that over time. Don't always assume when a customer complains that they're spending too much or that you're expensive, that is always necessarily a fault of you as the vendor. In many cases, it's also like, how do I help them become more sophisticated and more educated about how everything works as well?
Totally. Honestly, we should do a whole webinar on just how you have done this last point, because I think Snowflake has done some really great stuff. I think the way I would put it is if you're struggling with this problem, definitely hit me up. I'm happy to, I have thousands of examples of how companies have done this, but what we have seen in the market broadly is that 5 years ago, I think Snowflake was the icebreaker ship, kind of proving that you really want to align spend and value. And, if you're getting more value, you should expect to spend more. And they did a lot of work there. Frequently when customers are complaining like this, it's because they don't truly understand how the value is coming through. And they may still complain because it's expensive, and that's like a code for discount, but scaling price to value is almost always a leak somewhere in the value communication chain, or your product actually doesn't scale with the spend, and then that's a product problem. But if you can give customers what we say is visibility, control, and transparency, we actually are finding a market shift over the past 2 years in particular, where customers are actually requesting usage-based or consumption-based pricing, as long as they have governance tools like what Ryan was talking about, so that they don't accidentally spend too much. And I think that's actually a key shift in the market. Whereas a couple years ago, I think CFOs were a lot more resistant. We're actually seeing post-ZIRP a lot more demand for this model from the economic centers like finance or procurement, because it actually is a very easy equation to say, if I use your tool, it costs me $100,000 and I make $1 million. That's a very easy, if you make it easy for them to tell that story, it makes it really easy to go secure that budget. Okay. I think we're at time. Unfortunately, we have 30 more questions that people want to ask, but I think that just means that what Ryan said is super interesting, and there's a lot more pent up stuff. I think we will send out a link to to the conversation. I suspect we'll probably also like write up some of the questions and send them out to folks just so that they have like a high quality answer. But we really appreciate everyone being here. I want to thank Ryan and Alexa for helping pull this together, and Ryan in particular for taking time out of his day. I think like your knowledge is incredibly, it's super interesting, and actually this time was even more interesting than our talk. So we just got to keep running it back, and eventually we'll get to the perfect pricing. Thank you, Ryan.
Thank you everyone for joining, and we hope to see you at the next webinar on November 4th with Martin Casado on how AI is rewriting the rules of monetization. So thank you everyone, and we'll follow up with resources from today. Have a great day.